She signed the divorce papers on a Friday. Her hand didn't shake. Her voice didn't break. She simply picked up the cheap pen her attorney brought. Not the expensive kind, not the kind that makes you sign slower. And she wrote her name at the bottom of 8 years, Claire Ann Morgan. And she walked out. What Grant Whitfield didn't know, what no one knew, was that 3 weeks later, on the side of a highway in Pennsylvania, she stopped at a gas station and walked into a fluorescent-lit bathroom. And everything changed. He had called her infertile in a legal document. He had used her medical records as a weapon. He had chosen his word carefully. Impossible. When her doctor had said something completely different. The doctor said, difficult. He heard impossible. And standing in that gas station bathroom, holding something in her trembling hand, Claire understood 2 things at once. He was wrong about everything, and she was completely, terrifyingly alone. She made a choice that night, not to go back, not to fight, not to prove anything to anyone. She drove forward. And for 6 years, 6 quiet, hard, extraordinary years, no one knew what she was building. Until her daughter's heart needed answers that only one person could give. Until she had to go back. Until Grant Whitfield opened a letter and read words that stopped his world completely. This is the story of a woman who was told she wasn't enough and built a life so full, so real, so entirely her own, that when she finally walked back into the room where she was once diminished, she didn't feel a single thing that needed to be fixed. This story is for every woman who has ever been handed someone else's definition of her worth and had the quiet courage to write her own. If this story sounds like something you or someone you love needs to hear today, stay with us. Like this video, leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Every story we tell is for you.
The first sound was the pen scratching across thick paper. Not a keyboard, not the tap of a finger on glass. The specific, deliberate sound of a fountain pen moving across bond paper. Heavy. Certain. Like a door being closed from the inside. Claire Morgan had heard that sound before. 8 years ago, in a different conference room, she had heard it and felt something warm. Something like a rival. She had watched Grant Whitfield sign his name at the bottom of their prenuptial agreement, and she had thought, this is the beginning of everything. She had been 34 years old. She had believed that. Now she sat very straight in a chair that cost more than her first car, and she listened to the pen move across the last page, and she thought nothing at all. That's the last page, said the man across the table. He was one of Grant's attorneys. She did not know his name. She had been introduced to him 3 times over the past 6 weeks, and each time the name had slid out of her mind like water off glass. He had a very smooth face and very careful eyes, and he spoke in the particular tone of a man who delivers bad news for a living and has made peace with it. She did not look at Grant. She had not looked at Grant since she sat down. She picked up her own pen, the cheap one her attorney Sandra Beckett had brought. Sandra bought the same brand of ballpoint in bulk from an office supply store. Claire knew this because Sandra had mentioned it once in the dry way she mentioned most things. Expensive pens make people sign slower. I prefer fast. Claire signed her name, Claire Ann Morgan. She had kept her maiden name professionally throughout the marriage. Grant had never commented on this. She had always assumed it was because he didn't mind. She understood now that it was because it didn't matter to him. She was Mrs. Whitfield at charity events and board dinners and the opera. The name on her drafting table, the one gathering dust in the storage unit on the edge of the city, had never been his concern. She slid the documents back across the table. She did not look at Grant. I'll have the final settlement confirmation to your office by Friday, Sandra said. Her voice was pleasant and completely without warmth. Of course, said Grant's attorney. "We appreciate the efficiency." Sandra made a sound that was not quite agreement. Claire stood up. She did not look at Grant. She walked out of this conference room into a hallway that smelled of floor wax and climate-controlled air, and she pushed through a glass door into the October afternoon, and she stood on the sidewalk in front of a building on Market Street in Philadelphia, and she breathed. In, out. A taxi moved through the wet street. A woman in a yellow coat walked past, talking on her phone. A man was selling chestnuts from a cart on the corner, and the smell reached her, sweet and slightly burnt. And for one strange moment, Claire felt completely outside her own body, like she was watching this from somewhere else. A woman standing on a sidewalk in October, newly divorced, holding a cheap pen in her right hand. She looked down at the pen. She put it in her coat pocket. She walked to her car. Let me tell you about the last morning I spent as Mrs. Whitfield. Not the morning in the conference room. Not the morning Sandra called to say the papers were ready. The last ordinary morning. The last one where I still believed things were simply difficult, rather than over. 6 weeks before the conference room. The kitchen of the Whitfield townhouse on Rittenhouse Square. Philadelphia. October. The trees outside doing their annual performance of red and gold. So beautiful, it was almost aggressive. I was making coffee. French press. Grant's Way. 205 degrees, 4 minutes steep, pressed slow. I had made it this way for 8 years. I had not thought about the fact that I used to make it differently. Lighter, with a splash of vanilla creamer, I kept in the back of the fridge. Until that morning. Until I was standing at the counter, watching the press, and something shifted. I could not remember the last time I had made it my way. I could not remember when I had stopped. Grant came downstairs at 7:15. He was always beautifully dressed. That had never changed. The charcoal Italian suit, the white shirt with the fine blue stripe, his hair slightly damp from the shower, silver at the temples in a way that had always looked distinguished rather than old. And the cufflinks. I noticed the cufflinks. Silver, square, his initials engraved, GWW. But not the ones I had given him for our 5th anniversary. Those were gold, with a small diamond chip at the center, a detail so small most people would never see it. But Grant always noticed small details. These were different, newer. Someone had given Grant Whitfield a pair of cufflinks with his initials on them, and that someone was not me. I did not say anything. I handed him his coffee. He took it without looking up from his phone. He said, "I have a late meeting tonight." I said, "Okay." He said, "Don't wait up." I said, "I never do." He left. I stood at the kitchen window with my own coffee, his way, always his way, and I watched a taxi move through the wet October street below, and I thought about the cufflinks, and I thought about how long I had been not saying things. A long time. I had been not saying things for a very long time. I was not crazy. I knew what I was seeing. I had always known what I was seeing. The problem was that I had wanted very much to be wrong. The cufflinks were not the first thing. There had been months of things, small things. Grant's phone face down on the dinner table instead of face up. A change so small and so total that I could not remember exactly when it happened, only that one day I noticed it had been happening for a long time. Grant's increasing trips to New York, Tuesday evenings that stretched to Wednesday mornings, the way he had stopped touching my shoulder when he passed behind my chair at dinner. We had done that for years. An absent, affectionate thing, not even deliberate. And then one day it stopped, and I noticed the absence the way you notice a missing tooth. Not dramatically, just wrongly. I had been cataloging these things for months. Not suspicions, I told myself. Patterns. I was simply noticing patterns. I was lying to myself. But the lie was comfortable. and comfort had become more important to me than truth. That was one of the things I had traded away somewhere in 8 years of being Mrs. Whitfield. My appetite for difficult truths, my willingness to say, this doesn't fit. 2 weeks before the conference room, Grant had left his home office door open, not all the way, 6 inches maybe, enough for sound to travel. I was in the hallway with a book. I'd come downstairs to return to the shelf. I wasn't listening. I was walking past, and then I stopped, because Grant was speaking in a voice I had never heard him use on the phone. Not his business voice, measured, persuasive. The voice that had built an empire. Not his social voice, easy, charming, the voice that made rooms feel warmer. This was something else, something lower, something finished. He said, "She doesn't have to know the details. The diagnosis is enough. Use the diagnosis." I stopped breathing. I did not move. He said, "Diana's people are expecting confirmation by the end of the month. I need this clean, Warren." Warren Cole, his business partner of 15 years, his oldest friend. He said, "Claire will be taken care of financially. She always knew this marriage was about more than just us." I stood in that hallway for a very long time. Then I walked upstairs, very quietly. I sat on the edge of our bed. I picked up my phone 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock. I did not call anyone. I sat with the phone in my hands, and I listened to my own heartbeat, and I thought, the diagnosis. He said the diagnosis. What diagnosis? I found out 4 days later. Dr. Susan Hartley had been my doctor for 7 years. She had a calm office in Center City with a fish tank in the waiting room, and she always ran precisely on time. I liked her for both of these things. I had come in for what I believed was a routine visit. She greeted me warmly. She sat across from me at her desk. She folded her hands and said, "I wanted to let you know, I received a request for your records 2 weeks ago from a law firm." I said, "What?" She said, "It's standard in divorce proceedings. I assumed you knew." I said, "I didn't know." A brief silence. She said, "I'm sorry, Claire. I wouldn't have mentioned it if I'd known you hadn't been told." I said, "Which records?" She paused. "The findings from your evaluation 4 years ago. Your AMH levels. The diminished ovarian reserve diagnosis." The room felt very still. 4 years ago, Dr. Hartley had sat in the same chair and told me that my AMH levels were low, that my ovarian reserve was diminished. That conception would be, in her word, challenging. She had said, challenging. She had said, we should discuss options. She had said, this doesn't mean it's impossible. She had never said impossible. Grant had been at that appointment. He had sat beside me and held my hand. He had asked careful, intelligent questions. He had driven me home afterward and stopped at my favorite Italian restaurant and said nothing except that we would figure it out together. He had been in that room when she said challenging. He had heard the same word I heard. He chose a different word. I drove home from Dr. Hartley's office with my hands tight on the wheel, and the October light coming through the windshield at the low, sideways angle that always made Philadelphia look like a painting, beautiful and distant and not quite real. I thought, difficult. That's what she told me. Difficult, not impossible. There is a universe of difference between those two words. Grant knew that difference. He had heard the same appointment. He chose the word he needed. I'm not crazy. I know what I heard. I know exactly what this means. I did not confront him that night. I know people find this hard to understand. I find it hard to explain, even now. The thing is, when you have been not saying things for 8 years, there is a particular muscle required for saying them, and that muscle does not suddenly appear because you need it. You have to build it. You have to decide, consciously, that you are going to build it, and you have to give yourself time to do that. I came home from Dr. Hartley's office, and I made dinner. Lamb? His favorite. I made it on autopilot, the way I made the coffee, the way I ironed his shirts, the way I navigated the social calendar of the Whitfield household, like a quiet and competent administrator of someone else's life. Grant arrived at 7:15. He was in a good mood. He talked about a development project in Miami. His fork moved efficiently through the food. He refilled my water without being asked. A habit so old and automatic, it had become invisible, like furniture. I watched him. He was not nervous. That was the thing I kept coming back to. He was not afraid of being caught, not looking for guilt in my expression, not measuring my mood against what he might have left exposed. He was simply done. In his own mind, this marriage was already over, the next chapter already written, and he was simply finishing out the remaining scenes. He passed the bread basket across the table, and I thought, he is a stranger. He has been a stranger for some time. I just didn't let myself see it. The familiar had become foreign. The man I had shared a bed with for 8 years, whose preferences I knew the way you know a piece of music. Every pause, every emphasis, was reading from a script I had never been given. He had a whole other story running underneath this one. He had been running it for months, maybe longer. I said, "How was the rest of your day?" He said, "Productive." He speared a piece of lamb. "Warren thinks the Miami project will move faster than we projected, which is good because the New Jersey situation is still complicated." I said, "The Hartwell permits?" Something shifted in his face. Almost nothing. A fractional tightening around his eyes. In 8 years, I had become very good at reading his face. He said, "Still working through the regulatory process." He changed the subject. I filed this away. That night, after he fell asleep, I moved to the guest bathroom with my phone. I sat on the closed toilet lid with the door locked and the light on its lowest setting, and I typed into a search engine, Warren Cole Diana Hartwell. The results were not subtle. Diana Hartwell, 29 years old, the Hartwell family. Old New Jersey money, not as old as Grant's Philadelphia money, but newer and more liquid. 3 counties of development land that had been under regulatory hold for 4 years. The same 4 years during which Grant's New Jersey projects had been inexplicably stalled. I read for 2 hours. Diana Hartwell had been photographed at 2 Whitfield development charity events in the past year. In both photos, she was positioned slightly too close to Grant in the group shots. The kind of proximity that looks accidental. The kind that isn't. I typed, Diana Hartwell, Grant Whitfield, nothing public yet, nothing confirmed. Just the shape of a thing, visible if you were looking for it. I closed my phone. Diana Hartwell was not a midlife crisis. She was a real estate transaction. I just happened to be the asset he was liquidating to complete it. He planned this. This wasn't a fall. This wasn't weakness or confusion or a man doing something he couldn't stop himself from doing. This was a calendar. He had dates on a calendar, and I had been sitting across from him every night making his favorite lamb, and he had dates on a calendar. I called Ruth at 7 the next morning. She arrived at 7:45 with 2 gas station coffees, the terrible, burnt kind that comes in styrofoam cups. Because Ruth Calloway had a theory about appropriate beverages and serious situations. Fancy coffee meant there was time to think. Gas station coffee meant there wasn't. She sat at my kitchen counter, and she looked at me, and she said, "Okay, talk." I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which was not a thing Ruth usually did. She was a high school English teacher with opinions about everything and a habit of voicing them at full volume. Her silence was loud. When I finished, she set down her coffee cup. She said, "Honey, I have been biting my tongue for 2 years. 2 years." She held up 2 fingers. "You want to know what I know? Sit down. I'm going to need both of these coffees. What Ruth knew, the rumors that had moved through our social circle in the past year, quiet and careful, and never landing anywhere specific. The way Grant spoke about me at events, not unkindly, which would have been easier to identify, but as though I were a fixed feature of the landscape, something permanent and unremarkable. A good chair, nice lamp, the way Diana Hartwell had appeared in photographs. Ruth had not told me because, in her own words, you weren't ready to hear it, and I love you enough to wait. I said, he's using my medical records, Ruth. He's going to say I can't have children. That's why the marriage failed. Ruth set down her second coffee cup. She said a word, one word, short, precise, delivered at a volume that made the kitchen feel smaller. She was absolutely right. That night, Grant came to bed at 11. I was already there, lying on my side of the mattress, facing away from him. I was not asleep. He set his phone on the nightstand, screen down. It was always screen down now, a change so gradual I couldn't name when it had started. He settled into his pillow. His breathing slowed toward sleep. I lay there. 40 minutes. I counted them roughly by the rhythm of his breathing and the movement of light through the curtains from the street below. I lay there, absolutely still, next to a man who was already somewhere else, and I thought about one word, not betrayed, not devastated, not even angry, exactly, not yet. The word was prepared. When the time came, I was going to be prepared. 3 days later, he asked me to sit with him in the living room. His voice was careful, professional, the voice that won negotiations. He said, I think we both know this isn't working. I think we've known for some time. I said nothing. He said, the medical situation has made me think about legacy, about what we're building. I need to be honest with you about that. The medical situation, not our situation, not your situation. A situation, a neutral, clinical noun that made my body into a set of conditions rather than a person. He talked for 7 minutes. I counted. He mentioned different life goals. He mentioned what's best for both of us. He said, I will make sure you're provided for, Claire. I want to be fair. Fair. He wanted to be fair. When he finished, I said, I'll call my attorney tomorrow. He blinked. He had expected something else. He had expected the Claire who qualified everything. The Claire who said, I think maybe, before every declarative sentence. The Claire who had, over 8 years, learned to make herself smaller so that he had more room. He got the Claire who had been preparing since 2:15 in the morning 4 days ago. I stood up. I walked out of the living room. I went upstairs, and I got into bed, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought, I deserve better than this. I have always deserved better than this. I knew it, and I buried it, and it survived anyway, which is the most stubborn and hopeful thing about truth. It survives anyway. Let me tell you who I was before, not for sympathy, not to establish what was taken, just because she deserves to be named. I was 26 years old, finishing a graduate degree in architectural design at Penn. I had a studio apartment in West Philadelphia with a kitchen wall I had painted myself, a specific shade of sage green that I'd mixed from 2 different cans, adjusted 3 times until it was exactly right. I had a cat named Howard. He was orange and profoundly unimpressed by everything. I had strong opinions about brutalist architecture. I talked loudly in restaurants. I could spend 4 hours in a hardware store looking at paint chips and consider it a good afternoon. I had a practice, small, just starting, called Morgan Design. 2 clients, 1 decent commission, the beginning of something real. Then I met Grant Whitfield at a charity auction. He was buying a Basquiat print. He bought it without looking at the price. which I found both appalling and interesting. He had a fountain pen in his breast pocket. He laughed at something I said, something slightly too loud, probably, and looked at me like I was the most alive thing in the room. I had never been looked at quite like that. I did not understand, at 26, that being seen intensely by someone is not the same as being known. The changes came slowly. They always do. Year 1. I closed Morgan Design. We traveled constantly. The practice was hard to maintain. Grant said, "Just focus on us for now. You can always rebuild later." He was not wrong. I could have rebuilt later. I believed later was something I had unlimited quantities of. Year 2. I saw Ruth less. She was too blunt, too casual, slightly embarrassing at the formal events that now composed most of my social life. I didn't stop seeing her entirely. I reduced her. 2 hours every few weeks. I took this reduction and I called it balance, which is what you call things when you need them to sound reasonable. Year 4. I repainted the kitchen in the Rittenhouse Square townhouse. The new kitchen was white. Warm white, Grant's designer specified, the kind of white that photographs beautifully and tells you nothing about the person who lives with it. I painted over the sage green with my own hands. I remember the brush strokes, covering it, until it was gone. Year 6, a former client called. A major project, an art center in West Philadelphia, the kind of commission I had sketched imaginary versions of in graduate school. He said, "I thought of you immediately. No one else I have worked with thinks about space the way you do." I said, I would think about it. I meant to call back. I never called back. I told myself I was busy. I told myself there would be other projects. I told myself Grant needed me, and the household needed managing, and the calendar was full, and there would always be more time. There is never more time. There is only the time you choose, and I was not choosing it. I was letting it be chosen for me, and I was calling this love. And for a while, I believed that too. The regret I feel when I look back is not for the marriage. The marriage was what it was, a transaction dressed as a romance, which is not the most uncommon thing in the world. The regret I feel is for her, the woman with the sage green kitchen and the loud laugh and the cat named Howard. She didn't need to disappear. That wasn't a requirement of love. It was a requirement of the specific person I had chosen. And by the time I understood the difference, she had been gone for years. Sandra Beckett laid it out plainly. "They will argue," she said, "that the marriage was entered with the expectation of children, and that circumstances have materially changed. It's not the strongest argument in Pennsylvania family court, but combined with a generous financial settlement, they're hoping you'll accept it quickly." I said, "How quickly?" She said, 30-day window. They want this done before the end of the year. 30 days. That's what 8 years was worth to him. 30 days and a settlement figure and the words taken care of, as though I were a bill being settled, rather than a person being discarded. I said, "What if I don't accept?" Sandra said, "Then it gets messier. Are you prepared for messy?" I thought about this for a moment. I said, "I've been preparing for messy my entire adult life. I just didn't know it." She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. She said, "Good." 3 days before the papers were signed, Eleanor Whitfield came to see me. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, which she never did. Eleanor operated on a strict social schedule. Calls on Sunday evenings, visits arranged 2 weeks in advance. Nothing spontaneous, except in extreme circumstances. She wore lavender. She always wore lavender. It was her signature, the way the fountain pen was Grant's. She sat in my living room with a cup of tea she'd barely touched, and she folded her hands in her lap with the precision of a woman who has spent 70 years keeping herself contained. She said, "I want you to know I did not agree with the manner in which this has been handled." I said, "No?" She said, "No. Grant is making decisions based on what he wants to be true. That is a Whitfield weakness. The men in this family have always been better at building things than understanding them." She paused. She set her cup down. With that characteristic exactness, she said, "I hope you will be well, Claire. I mean that genuinely." She left. I stood at the window and watched her car move down the street, and I thought, she knew. She has known for some time. She came here to say something that isn't an apology, but is the closest thing to one her code allows. I did not know then what her knowledge would become. I did not know what she was setting in motion, sitting in my living room with her untouched tea and her lavender coat. I know now. The divorce was finalized on a Friday in late October. I drove to my mother's house in Lancaster afterward, 3 hours west on Route 30. The sky was gray and the trees were losing their leaves, and everything outside the window looked like the end of something, somewhere past a small town I can't remember the name of. I stopped at a gas station because I felt nauseated. I had felt nauseated for 5 days. I had been telling myself it was stress. I walked into the mini-mart and I stood in front of the small display of personal care items, and I bought a pregnancy test, the way you do something you've decided not to think too hard about. I took it into the gas station bathroom. Small, fluorescent, the floor slightly gritty under my boots. And I read the instructions I didn't need to read, and I waited 2 minutes and I looked at the result. 2 lines. I sat on the edge of the sink, ceramic, cold, and I held the test and I looked at myself in the mirror above it. Oh. Oh no, oh. The doctor said, "Difficult, not impossible." He said, "You can't give me what I need." And there I was, in a gas station bathroom off Route 30, holding the proof that he had been wrong about everything. I sat there for a long time. I washed my hands. I put the test in my jacket pocket. I got back in my car. I drove to my mother's house. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Not until I knew more. Not until I understood what I was holding. She had 2 choices: go back or go forward. She sat in her mother's driveway for 45 minutes before she chose. My mother's kitchen smells like pot roast and old books. Those 2 things, the warmth of slow-cooked meat and the particular dry sweetness of aged paper, have been the smell of home my entire life. Patricia Morgan spent 30 years as a librarian in Lancaster, and she brought the books home with her the way other people bring their work home, and they were on every surface. They were furniture. They were company. She was at the stove when I came in. She turned when she heard the door. She looked at my face. She said, "Sit down." Not what happened, not how are you. Just sit down, with the tone of a woman who has been paying attention and has some idea of what's coming. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table I had done homework at for 18 years, scratched and warm and solid as anything I had ever known. And I told her about the test, not about the divorce. She knew about the divorce. I had called her a week ago, and she had said what Patricia Morgan always said about painful things. "Well, that's that then. What do you need?" This was bigger. She set down her wooden spoon. She turned fully. She looked at her doctor. She said, "Does he know?" I said, "No." She turned back to the stove, stirred once. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" Not, "What are you going to do?" Not, "What should you do?" "What do you want to do?" That question. 3 words, one of them want, and the whole world shifted slightly on its axis. Because no one had asked me what I wanted in a very long time, including myself. I said, "I want to know if they're okay, before I decide anything." She nodded. "Then that's what we do first." Just that. No dramatic response, no catastrophe, no projection of futures. Just, first, we do the next thing. That was Patricia Morgan's entire philosophy, and it had gotten us through things before. It would get us through this. The smell of pot roast filled the kitchen. The November dark was coming in. Down through the window, the old house settled around us with its familiar creak. I was 45 minutes late, sitting in my car in the same driveway, unable to come inside. I had been trying to decide whether to tell Grant. In one column, he is the father. Children deserve to know their father. The legal situation is cleaner now. She might need support. In another column, he had just called her infertile in a legal document. He was already planning a new marriage. He would fight for custody, and he had more money and more lawyers and more everything. She did not trust him with something this precious. And then she had thought of Eleanor Whitfield in the living room. The men in this family have always been better at building things than understanding them. These were not things. These were children. She would not let them become entries in Grant Whitfield's legacy column. She would not hand him something extraordinary and watch him file it under asset. She had typed 3 words to Ruth: "I need you." Ruth arrived 2 hours later. She drove from where she'd been visiting family nearby. She walked into Patricia's kitchen with her coat still on and sat across from me and said, "How do you feel? Not what are you going to do? How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. I said, like I've been holding my breath underwater for 8 years, and I finally surfaced, and the air is cold, and I don't know if I'm glad to be breathing or just terrified of how cold it is. Ruth said, "Okay, that's real." She was practical in the way that good friends are practical in emergencies. No sentiment, no excess, just the next step and the step after that. "Get an OB appointment," she said, "then decide. The decision doesn't have to be tonight. It can wait until you have more information. Nothing about this has to happen before you're ready." 3 weeks later, the ultrasound showed 2 heartbeats. The technician said, "Twins." And something in Claire, something that had been very small for a very long time, suddenly, unexpectedly, expanded. Not happiness exactly, too early for happiness, too complicated for simple happiness, but something that felt like, oh, this is what's on the other side of this. This is what comes next. She chose Asheville because Ruth was there. Ruth had moved to Asheville 4 years earlier for a teaching position and had never left, which she explained as, "The mountains trapped me and I stopped minding." The city was small enough to feel human and large enough to be anonymous, far enough from Philadelphia that Grant's world did not extend there. A place where a woman starting over was so common it had become the local demographic. The move itself was 2 weeks of logistics that Claire carried out with the focused efficiency she had once applied to managing Grant's social calendar and now applied to her own survival. The apartment as above a pottery studio on the south side, 2 bedrooms, walls that smelled of clay, the kitchen a bright, clean white. She kept one wall white. She painted the kitchen a shade of sage green, not the exact same shade she had mixed at 26. Close enough to be a reference rather than a replica, a nod to who she had been rather than a return. She was not trying to go back. She was trying to go forward, carrying something she had left behind. Her drafting table came out of storage in Lancaster. Her mother had helped wrap it in moving blankets. It fit in the second bedroom, which would be the nursery for now, and her studio again someday. She set it up facing the window that looked over a small courtyard where someone had planted a Japanese maple that was, improbably, still in its fall color, red against gray sky. She stood at the drafting table for a long time. She placed her hands flat on its surface. "Hello," she thought. "I'm sorry it took so long." She got a new cat. Orange. Like Howard. She named him Howard II. This was, she thought, the most optimistic thing she had done in years. The legal framework was simple. A family law attorney in North Carolina confirmed what she had suspected. As the mother, in the state where the children were born and raised, her parental rights were complete. She was not legally required to inform the father unless she sought support or unless he discovered the children and pursued paternity through the courts. She would not seek support. She had the divorce settlement. Generous, because Sandra Beckett had been very good at her job. She had the beginning of a business plan on paper. She had Ruth. She had her mother, who would visit once a month and would never once make her feel like a failure for the path she was on. The children would know their father existed. She had decided this early, and she had never wavered from it. She would not lie to them. She would not construct a fiction. When they were old enough to ask real questions, she would give them real answers. But they would grow up safe, in a home where their worth was never conditional, never a function of what they could provide to someone else's legacy, not as assets, as people. She gave birth on a Tuesday in March. In Asheville, North Carolina, 600 miles from everything she used to be, the nurse placed Lily in her arms first. 6 pounds, 3 ounces, gray eyes already open and searching, looking at the world with the focused, evaluating expression of someone who intends to understand things properly before deciding how she feels about them. Claire said, out loud, to no one in particular, "Hello, I've been waiting for you." The early years were not easy, and they were not miserable. They were full. Lily and Lucas at 18 months, pulling each other's hair in the bathtub and both laughing about it, which was either a sign of healthy sibling bonding or a sign of two small people who had already discovered that the funniest thing in the world is someone else's mild suffering. Lucas, at 2, his first clearly articulated word was no. Not mama, not more, not the common ones. No, delivered firmly, seriously, to a bowl of peas with the expression of a man who has considered the matter and reached a definitive conclusion. I recognized the stubbornness immediately. I knew exactly where it came from. I decided to be impressed rather than worried. Lily at 2.5, already architectural in her attention to space. She arranged her stuffed animals by size before she could talk in full sentences. She watched rooms before she entered them. She had Grant's eyes and my way of moving through the world, which I found simultaneously devastating and beautiful. Morgan Design Consultancy began as a one-woman operation out of the apartment's second bedroom, between the drafting table and the portable crib. The first client was a restaurant owner in West Asheville, who needed a renovation concept on a very small budget. She delivered something extraordinary for almost nothing. She charged him fairly. He referred her to 3 people. Those 3 became 12. She hired her first assistant at the end of year 2, a 23-year-old named Becca, who wore her hair in a long braid and had strong opinions about sustainable materials, and once reorganized the entire file system while Claire was at a parent-teacher conference, which would have been presumptuous, except that she was completely right. By year 3, she had 6 employees and a genuine office, a converted loft 2 blocks from Ruth's school, high ceilings, exposed brick, a big window that let in the afternoon mountain light. Children's drawings were tacked to the walls because Claire's childcare situation was imperfect, and sometimes Lily and Lucas simply came to the office, where they established a corner with a rug and a basket of books, and the particular self-contained competence of children who have spent their early years in adult workplaces. She was building something real. She could feel it in the way you feel solid ground after a long time on water. She did not obsessively follow Grant's life, but she moved through the world, and the world occasionally produced information. Grant and Diana were married 8 months after the divorce. A large wedding in Philadelphia. The society coverage was substantial. Diana wore a dress that took up a full page of the style section. Grant stood beside her in a charcoal suit. The same charcoal he had always worn, which was either loyalty to a preference or a failure of imagination, and she had stopped caring which. Diana had a child 10 months after the wedding, a boy. The society pages called him the Whitfield heir. Grant's company posted a photograph, father and son, the particular pride of a man who has received exactly what he was shopping for. She looked at the photograph. She braced for it, the way you brace for cold water. She had been bracing for months. And then she looked at his face, and she thought, that's it. That's the man who defined my worth for 8 years. He looked tired, a little soft around the jaw. The particular look of a man at 42 who has gotten what he wanted and discovered it is heavier than he expected. He looked ordinary. He looked like the man at the school board meeting who talks too long. He looked like someone's tired father-in-law at Thanksgiving. He looked like a person, not a force, not a verdict. A person. And the extraordinary thing about seeing a betrayer as ordinary, as just a person who made small, selfish choices, is how free it makes you. Not happy, exactly. Not vindicated, exactly. Just free. The way you are free once you realize the thing you were afraid of is only as large as your fear made it. The Hartwell permits, it turned out, did not unfold as planned. The New Jersey development encountered environmental opposition. A coalition of residents and conservation groups that had been organizing for 2 years. Grant's company took a significant financial hit. Warren Cole departed the partnership the following year under circumstances that the business press described as an amicable restructuring of leadership responsibilities, which in Philadelphia business circles was understood to mean something considerably less amicable. By year 4 of Claire's Asheville life, Whitfield development had contracted. Not collapsed, but smaller, less certain, less like the empire and more like a business that had made some consequential mistakes and was working through them. She did not feel glad. She wanted to be honest about that. She felt something more complicated than glad, something closer to, well, and, of course, and I hope the children are okay. His children with Diana. A small boy who had Grant's deliberate manner and would grow up knowing who his father was. She hoped he was okay. She genuinely hoped that. Lucas asked his first serious question when he was 4 years old. He had been watching his school friend Marcus get picked up by Marcus's father, a large bearded man named Dan, who arrived in a pickup truck and swung Marcus up onto his shoulders and carried him to the parking lot that way, Marcus shrieking with delight. Lucas watched this. He was quiet in the car on the way home. He had his father's quality of stillness before a conclusion. After dinner, while she was washing dishes, he said, "Do we have a dad?" She turned off the water. She dried her hands. She sat down at his level, which was one of the things she had learned in 4 years of parenting. Get down to their level for the important things, so the conversation isn't coming from above them. She said, "Yes." He said, "Where is he?" She said, "He lives far away, in Philadelphia. His name is Grant." Lucas processed this. Does he know about us? That question, from a 4-year-old, 3 words. Does he know? And they stopped her heart for 3 full seconds. She said, "Not yet." He thought about this. He said, "When will he know?" She said, "When the time is right." He considered this, with his father's expression of careful evaluation. Then he asked for a popsicle. The conversation was over for him. It was not over for her. She sat in the kitchen long after he fell asleep. She sat at the table where they ate breakfast every morning and helped with homework every evening, and argued about peas, and negotiated bedtimes, and read together under a shared blanket on rainy afternoons. The kitchen, where she had built a life that was genuinely, unambiguously good. And she thought about the question she had been avoiding, not about Grant, about herself, not tonight, not yet, but soon. It was 2 a.m, and she was reorganizing the kitchen drawers. Not because they needed reorganizing. They were fine. They were organized within reason. There was nothing wrong with them. She was reorganizing them because she was overwhelmed, and this was what she did when her mind moved too fast. She arranged things. She had done this since she was 17. Her mother did it too. It was either a coping mechanism or a family trait, and possibly both. She took everything out of the utensil drawer and laid it on the counter. She examined each item with the focused attention of someone who has never seen a spatula before. She picked up a lemon zester. She had owned this lemon zester for 11 years. It had moved with her from West Philadelphia to Rittenhouse Square to the storage unit to Asheville. She had never, in 11 years, made anything that required a lemon zester. She had been carrying it from place to place for over a decade, as though it might one day be necessary. She stood in her kitchen at 2 a.m. with a lemon zester in her hand. She thought about all the things she had carried: the lemon zester, the habit of making coffee the wrong way, the instinct to qualify every opinion, the practice of making herself smaller, the belief that her medical file was a verdict rather than a probability. She threw the lemon zester away. It felt surprisingly good. The children were at Patricia's for the weekend. Ruth was at a teachers' conference in Charlotte. Claire was alone in the apartment for the first time in what felt like years. Not just an evening, a full 2 days. 48 hours of silence that was nobody's silence but hers. She had made plans. A bath, a book, the kind of quiet restoration she had promised herself for years and never quite achieved. She had a list on her phone: farmer's market in the morning, the new architecture exhibit downtown, that restaurant on Broadway she'd been meaning to try. She sat on her couch and looked at the wall, and she did not get up. It was a Friday evening in late autumn. She was 40 years old. She had a successful business. She had 2 remarkable children. She had a good apartment, a good friend, a good life by any honest measure. She sat on her couch, and the question that had been waiting patiently in the hallway of her mind for 6 years finally came in and sat across from her. Who are you, Claire? Who are you? Not what do you do? Not what have you built? Not what are your children like? Not any of the performance questions, the resume questions. Who are you when there is no one to perform for? Because Grant had defined her as wife, then as infertile, then as failed wife. These were his definitions, but she had lived inside them so long they had become familiar, even the painful ones, even the ones that diminished her. And then she had spent 6 years defining herself in reaction to that. Mother, survivor, builder, successful woman who did not need him. But those were all still definitions built in opposition to something. They were still someone else's question, just answered differently. Who was she without any of it? She sat with this for a long time. She did not cry. She expected to cry. She thought facing this question directly would break something open, but it didn't. It was quieter than that, like standing in a room after all the furniture has been removed. Not empty in a bad way. Empty in the way that is also spacious, just light and walls and the particular silence of potential. She had been so many things, for so many people, for so long. She had been Mrs. Whitfield. She had been the architect who stopped. She had been the infertile wife. She had been the woman who ran. She had been the single mother building something from nothing. All of those things were true. None of them was all of her. She sat in the quiet, and she let the question be unanswered for a while, which felt like the most honest thing she had done in years. At 2 in the morning, she was at her laptop. She started with diminished ovarian reserve and successful pregnancy. She read for 45 minutes. There were hundreds of stories. Women who had been told challenging and experienced possible. Women whose doctors had used the same careful language as Susan Hartley. Not impossible, just harder. And who had, with intervention or without, become mothers. She already knew this. She had the proof of it, asleep in 2 small beds down the hall. She read the stories anyway, because sometimes you need to hear your truth reflected back to you from other people's mouths before it fully settles into your bones. Then she searched how to tell children about absent parent. She read for another hour. Articles, forums, the careful advice of child psychologists. The consensus was something she already understood intellectually, but needed to feel in her body. Children can handle truth given with love. What they cannot handle is silence that pretends to be peace. Lucas was 4. He had asked the question and accepted when the time is right, because 4-year-olds will accept almost any answer delivered with sufficient calm. But he would not stay 4. He would be 5, then 6, then 10, then 15. The questions would grow with him. They would become less patient. She was already running out of time. Almost without deciding to, she typed, Grant Whitfield, Philadelphia. The news results were not what she expected. Whitfield development facing liquidity concerns, board restructuring, a business journal piece from 6 months ago. Grant in a charity gala photograph, still handsome, still the fountain pen in his breast pocket, but with something around his eyes that the camera couldn't quite hide. Something tired. Something like the specific exhaustion of a man who got what he was reaching for and found it weighed more than he calculated. And then, 3 months ago, Grant and Diana Whitfield announce amicable separation. She stared at this for a long time. She closed her laptop. She sat in the dark. She was not glad. She wanted to be very clear with herself about this. His unhappiness was not her satisfaction. She had not built 6 years of her own life in order for his life to fall apart, and she did not measure her success against his failure. But she understood something she hadn't understood fully before. He had been unhappy for a long time, too. He had just chosen a much more expensive way to express it. Dr. Carol Finch had been Claire's therapist for 2 years. She had a warm office in a building near the center of Asheville. Spider plants on every surface. A sound machine by the door that produced what was optimistically labeled soft rain, but sounded more like a moderately enthusiastic applause. Claire had come to find it comforting. What would telling him cost you? Dr. Finch asked. Control, Claire said. Safety, the ability to protect Lily and Lucas from whatever version of himself he's currently being. And what does not telling him cost you? It already costs me. Every time Lucas asks, every time I have to decide how much truth is the right amount. Every time Lily looks at her drawing and puts it in the maybe pile instead of the keep pile, because she doesn't know who to show it to. So both options have a cost. Both options have a cost, Claire said. The question is, which cost I can live with. Dr. Finch waited. Not forever, Claire said. I can't live with the silence forever. I knew that before you asked. I've known it for a while. Dr. Finch said, What are you waiting for? Claire looked at her hands. I don't know. Ready, maybe. Whatever that feels like, Dr. Finch said. In my experience, ready is a decision, not a feeling. She wrote the letter on a Thursday night. Longhand. On actual paper, at her drafting table, her own pen. Not Grant's style, a thinner nib, faster, the way she wrote, which was the way she thought. Quick and precise, and occasionally running ahead of itself. She wrote everything. 8 years of what she had swallowed. The cufflinks she noticed, the phone calls she had heard, the way she had lain in the dark next to him, pretending to sleep while he checked his screen-down phone. The conference room, and the cheap pen, and the fountain pen, scratching across paper, and the October light on the Philadelphia sidewalk, and the gas station bathroom off Route 30, and everything that came after. She wrote about Lily and Lucas, their specifics. Lily's habit of watching a room before she walked into it. Lucas's absolute certainty about everything, delivered at full volume. The way they were different from each other in every particular, and yet completely, unmistakably, a unit. She wrote about the morning Lily arranged her cereal into patterns before eating it, and the morning Lucas decided, completely unprompted, that breakfast required a speech. She wrote, "They are extraordinary. They have your eyes and my stubbornness, which I realize is not a comfortable combination, but I want you to know it is incredibly beautiful to watch." She wrote for 2 hours. She folded the letter. She put it in an envelope. She addressed it to Grant Whitfield, Rittenhouse Square, Philadelphia. She put it in her nightstand drawer. She did not send it, not because she couldn't, because ready was a decision, and she hadn't made it yet. But she was close. She could feel herself getting close. The call came on a Tuesday morning in April. Claire was at the office. She had a client meeting in 20 minutes. A hotel renovation in downtown Asheville, the biggest project Morgan Design had taken on. She was reviewing material samples. The call came from a Philadelphia area code she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice was professional, warm, careful. "Mrs. Morgan, this is Dr. Annette Shaw at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I'm calling regarding Lily's cardiac evaluation." Lily had been experiencing occasional irregular heartbeats for 3 months. Her pediatrician in Asheville had recommended a full evaluation. The referral had gone to Philadelphia, the best pediatric cardiology program in the region, and Dr. Shaw had been the physician conducting the workup. She said, "We've identified a congenital cardiac variant, a structural difference in the left ventricle. It's manageable and likely not serious, but it will require monitoring, and, this is important, we need a complete family history from both sides." Claire said, "The maternal side, I can provide." Dr. Shaw said, "I understand the paternal side may be complicated, but cardiac conditions, in particular, can have a hereditary component. Without both parents' family histories, we're making decisions with incomplete information. Is there any way to contact the father?" Claire said, "I'll handle it." She sat for a long time after the call ended. The client meeting happened. She was present for all of it, in the professional sense. Answers came out of her mouth that were correct, samples were reviewed, decisions were made. Becca gave her a look at one point that said, "You're somewhere else, and I see it, but I also see you handling it, so I'll wait." After the meeting, Claire sat in her office with the door closed. She thought about Lily's gray eyes, about the way Lily watched things before engaging them, about a small girl with a heart that required monitoring and a family history that existed on one side only. She opened her phone. She called Stephen Burrows. Stephen Burrows had known about the twins for 2 years. She had told him in a consultation that she initially framed as hypothetical. What would the legal situation be if a woman in this scenario had not informed the father, and he had listened to her careful framing for approximately 90 seconds before saying, with characteristic dryness, "Claire, these are your children we're discussing. I can tell. Would you like to drop the hypothetical?" She had laughed. She hadn't laughed like that in months. He was not surprised by this call. He had been waiting for some version of it. He gave her the practical picture in the efficient way he gave everything. Grant's parental rights are not extinguished by your silence. Paternity once acknowledged, or court-ordered, comes with rights and responsibilities. Once he knows, he will have an attorney on the phone within 24 hours. Expect aggressive pursuit of visitation at minimum, given his resources. He also said, "But here is your position. You have been the primary and sole parent for 6 years. You have provided stability, consistency, and a documented home environment of genuine quality. Courts favor stability above almost everything. You are not in a weak position." He said, "You are not in trouble here. You are in a complicated situation with a legal path through it." She said, "What's my first move?" He said, "You reach out to him directly, in writing, before a court compels you to. That demonstrates good faith, and good faith matters." She said, "Okay." A pause. He said, "Are you ready for this?" She said, "I've been getting ready for 6 years." She drove into Philadelphia on a Wednesday morning with Lily and Lucas in the back seat. She hadn't been in the city in 6 years. The skyline appeared on the horizon, and her body responded before her mind did. A tightening across her chest, a particular alertness, the physical memory of having lived a whole life here. The city looked exactly like itself. It had continued being Philadelphia without her, completely indifferent to her absence, which was either comforting or insulting, and she had decided to call it comforting. Lucas from the back seat, "This is where Daddy lives?" "Yes," she said. Lily not looking up from her tablet. "Is it nice?" She was passing Rittenhouse Square. The trees were in their early spring green. The park looked the way it always had, beautiful and slightly forbidding, the park of a city that takes itself seriously. "It's very nice," she said, "and very cold." She meant the temperature. She didn't realize until later she meant the other thing too. She had sent the letter, the one from the nightstand drawer, plus a formal cover note from Stephen, to Grant's office address that morning via courier. It would arrive before noon. It arrived at 11:40. She knew when he read it because Stephen's phone rang at 2:15 that afternoon. Grant Whitfield, requesting a meeting, not attorney to attorney, a direct meeting, just the two of them and their respective lawyers, in a conference room as soon as possible. Stephen called her. She was at the hotel across from Children's Hospital where they were staying. Lucas was watching television. Lily was doing a puzzle with the focused intensity she brought to all projects, requiring spatial reasoning. Stephen said, "He wants to meet Friday morning. Are you available?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And how are you?" She thought about it. "I'm clear," she said. "I know exactly why I'm here and what I'm doing and what I need. That's the most ready I've been for anything in 6 years." The night before the meeting, she stood in the hotel bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. 40 years old, lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there at 34. Her hair shorter, a decision she had made 2 years ago when long hair became something she no longer had patience for, and when she stopped being interested in performing a particular kind of femininity for anyone who hadn't asked. She looked like herself. Not like the woman she had been, like the woman she was. She said out loud, to her own reflection, "You are going to be fine." Not a wish, not a hopey, a statement, a fact she was declaring into existence. She went to bed. She slept, against all reasonable expectation, very well. She dreamed of nothing significant, just the ordinary images of an ordinary life, which was, she thought when she woke, exactly the point. At 7:15 in the morning, someone knocked on her hotel room door. She was already dressed. The navy coat, the good one, The one she had bought with the fee from her first major commercial project. She opened the door. Eleanor Whitfield stood in the hallway, 71 years old, lavender coat, 2 cups of coffee, and a carrier from the cafe in the hotel lobby. She said, "I thought we should talk first." Claire stepped back and let her in. Eleanor set the coffees on the small table by the window. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. The same precise gesture from the living room 6 years ago, the same posture that said, "I have decided to say something, and I am going to say it correctly." She said, "I have known since they were about 2 years old." Claire went very still. Eleanor said, "I have a college friend who moved to Asheville many years ago. She recognized you at a school event. Lily and Lucas were there. She sent me a photograph." A pause. "I knew immediately. The eyes. You cannot mistake the Whitfield eyes." The room was quiet. "You've known for 4 years," Claire said. "Yes." "And you said nothing." Eleanor looked at her with an expression that was not quite apology and not quite explanation. It was something more like honesty. "I was waiting for you to be ready," she said. "I did not want to force this before you were prepared." She paused. "I also did not believe that my son deserved to be protected from the natural consequences of his choices. I am his mother. I love him. That has never meant I was blind to what he is." Another silence. Eleanor said, "May I meet them?" Claire looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up and opened the connecting door. Lucas was already awake, standing on the bed, in his pajamas with the expression of someone who has been waiting for an audience. He saw Eleanor, a very correct elderly woman in a lavender coat, sitting very straight, and regarded Hertz with his father's expression of careful, unhurried evaluation. He said, "Are you important?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I believe I am your great-grandmother." He considered this information. Then, "Do you want to watch cartoons?" Eleanor Whitfield, who had not watched cartoons in 65 years, said, "Yes, I believe I do." The conference room was different from the one 6 years ago. Different building, different furniture, different view through the window, but the same atmosphere. The climate-controlled air, the expensive silence, the weight of things being decided. These rooms all felt the same because what happened in them was always the same, history being made in a place designed to look neutral. Grant arrived first. He was seated when Claire came in with Stephen. 6 years. He stood when she entered. Old manners, automatic. And then sat back down. He looked at her across the table, and she looked at him across the table. And for one long moment, there was just the fact of time. 6 years of it. Between them, like a country they had both lived in and then separately left. He looked older, not badly older, but older in the specific way of a man for whom things have not gone according to plan. Smaller than the version of him she had been carrying in her head. And she understood now that she had been carrying a very large version, inflated by fear and history and the particular way pain makes things larger. This man was just a man, tired. Looking at his hands. He looked up. He said, "You look well." She said, "I am well." This was the truth. It landed between them like something final. The formal part of the meeting moved efficiently. Stephen presented the documentation. The question of paternity, Grant's attorney began a sentence about a possible test, and Grant interrupted him. He said, "That won't be necessary." He looked at the photographs Stephen had placed on the table. He said, "That's my son's face." His voice was steady, and something else was underneath the steadiness. The discussion of legal framework. Rights and responsibilities. What the process of formalizing paternity would require. Grant was mostly quiet. He asked two questions. Are they healthy? Claire said, Lily has a cardiac variant that needs monitoring. That's why we're here. We need your family's cardiac history. He went to shade paler. He said, my grandfather had a heart condition. My father had a valve replacement at 58. She wrote this down. Her hand was steady. This was the information she came for. This was what had brought her back to Philadelphia. Not justice, not closure, not anything dramatic. Information that her daughter needed to be properly cared for. Then he asked his second question. Can I see them? A long pause, she said, that depends on the kind of man you decide to be, starting now. After the formal meeting, the lawyers stepped out. Conference room, just the two of them, for the first time in 6 years. He said, I should have asked more questions about the diagnosis, about what it actually meant. She said, yes, you should have. He said, I was making decisions based on what I needed to be true. She said, I know. Your mother told me the same thing. 6 years ago, in my living room, she came and had tea and told me that the Whitfield men are better at building things than understanding them. She paused. She was being very careful and very kind about it. Something moved across his face, a recognition of something he would rather not recognize. He said, I told myself it was the right decision, that we both knew it wasn't working, that I was being practical. She said, and was it the right decision? He said nothing. She said, I'm not asking you to answer that for me. I have my answer, but you should know yours. Before you meet your children, you should be honest with yourself about what you did. She stood up. She buttoned her coat. The navy one, the good one, the one that meant something. She said, I'm not here to punish you, Grant. I don't want your money. I don't need your apology, though I hear it in what you're not quite saying. I want Lily to have a complete family history. I want Lucas to stop asking questions I can't answer. That is what I'm here for. That is all I'm here for. She walked to the door. He said, Claire. She stopped but didn't turn. He said, I made you smaller. I know that. I convinced myself I was giving you a life, and was taking one. She stood there for a moment. She said, yes. She walked out. In the hallway, she stood with her hand on the wall and took a breath so deep it made her slightly dizzy. Stephen was there. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been in family law for 30 years and has seen most things. He said, that was one of the most composed things I have ever witnessed in 30 years of this work. She said, thank you. Then she went to find her children and take them to get pancakes, because after 6 years and 40 minutes in a conference room, they had absolutely earned pancakes. 3 days later, a park Claire had chosen, public, busy, neutral, with good sightlines. Late afternoon, the spring light that makes Philadelphia look almost gentle. Lily was on a swing. Lucas was investigating a puddle with the dedication and solemnity of a scientist who has been assigned a particularly interesting specimen. Grant arrived alone. No attorney, casual clothes, jeans and a dark jacket. The first time she had seen him in casual clothes in years. He looked uncertain. Genuinely uncertain, in a way that was recognizable and slightly human. Lucas saw him first. He stopped. He looked at the stranger with the gray eyes that were identical to his own. He studied him the way he studied everything that interested him, completely, unhurriedly, making up his own mind. He said, Are you Grant? Grant crouched down. He said, Yes, I am. Lucas said, Mom said you live in Philadelphia. I do, Grant said. We're from Asheville, Lucas said. It's better. Grant, after a moment, I've heard that. Lily had stopped swinging. She was watching from her end of the park, with her father's eyes and her mother's patience. She said, "Hi." Grant looked at his daughter. He said, "Hi." They stayed for 90 minutes. No declarations, no dramatic moments. No one cried. They pushed Lucas on the swing. They watched Lily explain the structural logic of a puddle's edges to a man who had built buildings his entire life and had apparently never considered puddle architecture. Claire sat on a bench at a careful distance. She had expected to feel something large, grief maybe, or anger, or the complicated satisfaction of watching a man confront what he had discarded. She felt none of these things particularly. She felt something quieter. She felt something almost like relief. The news spread the way Philadelphia society news always spreads. Slowly at first, then everywhere at once. Eleanor, who had known for 4 years, did not deny it when asked. For Eleanor Whitfield, denial was a form of lying, and lying was a form of code violation. And Eleanor's code was the most load-bearing thing about her. Within a week, the people who needed to know knew. Grant's board, Grant's remaining business partners, the charity circles and the club memberships, and the overlapping social networks of old Philadelphia money. Diana was told by her attorney the day before it became generally known. She called Claire 3 days later. Claire almost didn't answer. She answered. Diana's voice on the phone was very controlled. The voice of a woman who had also received information she hadn't expected and was deciding in real time what to do with it. She said, "I was told you couldn't have children. He said it was confirmed. He said the marriage had failed because of this and both of you had accepted it. I believed him." Claire said, "I know." Diana said, "I'm sorry. I want to say that simply. I was given a version of the truth that was designed to be convenient, and I didn't question it because I had no reason to. I'm sorry." A long pause. Claire said, "Are you okay?" Diana said, "Not particularly. Are you?" Claire said, "I've been okay for about 3 years. It takes time." Another pause. Diana said, "He told me you were cold, distant, that you had both known for a long time the marriage was over, and you were simply going through the motions." Claire said, "I know he told you that." Diana said, "I want you to know I would have made different choices if I had known the truth." Claire thought about this. She thought about it for a moment, honestly. She said, "I believe you." The call lasted 12 minutes. It was not the beginning of a friendship. Their histories were too complicated for that word, but it was something. Two women who had been used as pieces in someone else's plan, comparing notes on what that plan had cost each of them. Claire hung up and sat with her phone in her lap. She thought about what it cost to be the woman you are supposed to be, the version others need you to be, the wife who is grateful, the lover who asks no questions, the woman whose medical file is a story told by someone else. She thought about what it cost. And she thought about what it cost to stop. Grant stepped back from the chief executive role at Whitfield Development in a statement released on a Thursday morning. The statement cited a desire to focus on personal matters and expressed full confidence in the incoming leadership team. The business press covered it with the particular precision of people who know what isn't being said. The environmental opposition in New Jersey had been costly, both financially and in terms of the reputational damage that comes when a company's decision-making process becomes a subject of public scrutiny. Warren Cole's departure had never been fully explained. A board restructuring was overdue, and everyone had been waiting to see how it would happen. It happened this way, quietly, without drama. Grant remained a significant shareholder. He was not ruined. He was diminished, and the diminishment was proportionate, and it was public, and it was accurate. Eleanor called Claire from her house in Chestnut Hill. She said, "He is making better choices now. I want you to know that. I am not asking you to feel differently about what happened, but I thought you should know. Claire said, "Thank you, Eleanor." Eleanor said, "Please bring the children to dinner before you leave Philadelphia. I make a proper roast." Claire said, "We'll come on Sunday." The profile of Morgan Design Consultancy ran in 2 architecture publications within the same month that Whitfield Development's restructuring made the business news. This was not planned. It was simply what happens when the truth moves at its own pace. The profile described Claire's work in terms she would not have used herself, but recognized as accurate: sustainable, rigorously human, community-rooted. Her approach to commercial interiors as designing for the people who would actually inhabit the spaces rather than the people who would photograph them. One reviewer wrote, "There is a specificity in Morgan's work that suggests a designer who has thought carefully about what it means to belong somewhere." She read this in her hotel room on a Tuesday night. She read it twice. She thought about the woman who had given up her practice because it was inconvenient to the schedule of a man who was already planning to leave her. The woman who had filed Morgan Design under later and discovered too late that later had a limited supply. She called Ruth. Ruth picked up on the second ring. She said, "I read it. I have 7 copies. I framed one. It is hanging in my classroom between the Emily Dickinson quote and the school's mission statement, and I will fight anyone who suggests it should be moved." Claire laughed. Fully, without calculating it, the way she used to laugh in restaurants before she learned to moderate it. Somewhere along the way, she had become someone she actually liked. She hadn't noticed when it happened. It had happened anyway, quietly, the way good things often do. Sunday at Eleanor Whitfield's house in Chestnut Hill. The house smelled of roast and lavender and the specific combination of beeswax polish and old wood that was the smell of old money applied to old architecture. Not unpleasant. Actually quite beautiful. The smell of a house that had been loved for a long time. Lucas was in the living room making Eleanor laugh. Eleanor Whitfield was not a woman who laughed easily. She had a very precise social smile and a genuine laugh that appeared rarely and sounded slightly surprised, as though she was caught off guard by her own amusement. Lucas had produced it 3 times in 20 minutes with a story about a frog he had seen in Asheville and his plans to keep it, which Claire had vetoed twice, and he had clearly concluded that great-grandmothers were a more sympathetic jurisdiction. Lily was sitting beside Eleanor on the sofa with a photograph album from Eleanor's coffee table. Family photographs going back 60 years. Whitfield faces in various eras of Philadelphia. Lily pointed to a photograph. "Is that Daddy when he was little?" Eleanor said, "Yes, he was about your age." Lily studied the photograph for a long time. "He looks like Lucas." Eleanor said, "He does." Grant was across the room, talking to Stephen Burrows, who had come because there were still legal conversations happening. He caught Claire's eye across the table. He looked away first, not dramatically, just looked away. She looked at her children, at this extraordinary, improbable table, at a 71-year-old woman being charmed by a frog story she clearly did not want to find as funny as she was finding it. At the afternoon light coming through Eleanor's tall windows onto old wood and old photographs and new faces that carried the old eyes, and she thought, this is what was at the other side of the gas station bathroom on Route 30. This exact table, these exact people, this mess of history and consequence and 2 small children who would grow up knowing where they came from and not being diminished by it. She reached for her wine glass. She took a sip. She was, she realized, genuinely happy. Not the compensatory happiness of someone who has convinced herself things are fine. Not the performed happiness of a person moving through the expected motions. Just happy. Just this. The last night of the Philadelphia trip. She packed methodically, the way she always did, shoes in the outer pocket, liquids in the clear bag, clothes folded by outfit for the drive home. She had developed this system in the early years of doing everything herself. Travel with 2 small children required a level of organization that would have impressed a military logistics officer. In the outer pocket of her bag, she found the pen. The fountain pen she had brought for signing documents. She had bought it 3 years ago when she signed the first major commercial contract for Morgan Design. A deliberate choice. She had wanted to reclaim the fountain pen as a thing that belonged to her, not to the memory of a conference room and a man whose signatures had always seemed to close things off, rather than open them. Her pen was a thinner nib, faster, the way she wrote, which was the way she thought. She held it in her hand. She thought about the scratch of pen on paper in a conference room 8 years ago, the warmth she had felt, the arrival she had believed she was experiencing. She put the pen in the inside pocket of her coat, where she would feel it when she reached her hand in, near. Ruth called from Asheville. "How are you doing?" Ruth asked. Not the edited answer, the real one. "I'm tired," Claire said. "The good kind, the kind where you're tired because you did something that mattered. Was it worth it? Going back? I'm glad Lily has a complete family history. I'm glad Lucas got to ask his questions and get real answers. I'm glad I walked into that conference room and felt like myself the whole time." She paused. "That's what I came for. That's what I got. And Grant?" A pause. "He's just a person," Claire said. "He was always just a person. I had him too large in my mind for too long. I was using the size of him, the threat of him, the verdict of him, to explain my own smallness. And he was just a person making selfish choices and calling them practical." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Becca called. The hotel project client wants to add a rooftop bar." "Of course he does." "I said you'd call Monday." "I'll call Monday." "Drive safe tomorrow." "I will." She hung up and stood at the hotel window, looking at the Philadelphia night, the lit windows of other rooms, the street below with its late evening traffic, slower now, the city settling toward midnight. She had come here 6 years ago for the last time, newly divorced, a pin in her pocket, and the beginning of everything she didn't know she was beginning. She was leaving with something different, not healed exactly, not finished exactly, something more like accurate. She had an accurate picture of who she was and what she had built and what she was going back to. That was enough. That was more than enough. The morning. Grant was in the hotel lobby when she came down with the children and their luggage. He had asked, through Stephen, for a few minutes before they left. She had said yes. She settled Lily and Lucas with Eleanor, who had come to say goodbye and who was now negotiating the terms of a potential frog, and she walked to where Grant was standing by the lobby window. They sat in 2 chairs that faced each other at a slight angle, not quite confrontational, not quite comfortable. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Okay." He said, "What was it like? The 6 years, the building?" She looked at him. This was the most genuine question he had ever asked her. Not about the divorce, not about the legal situation, not about what she wanted, or what she needed, or what had to happen next, about her, about the actual experience of her actual life. She thought about how to answer it honestly. She said, "Hard at first. The first year was genuinely hard. Then it got good. Then it became mine." That's the right word. Mine. Not built against anything, or for anything, or to prove anything. Just mine. He said, "I made you smaller. I know that now. I was telling myself I was providing you with a life, and I was taking one. She said, yes. He said, I'm sorry. The apology came out simply, not with drama or elaborate structure, like a fact being stated correctly. She said, I know. Not, I forgive you. Not, it's okay. Not, I know, and I'm releasing you from the weight of it. Just, I know. Acknowledgement without absolution. Truth without performance. Something settled between them. Not reconciliation, not warmth. Something more like the end of active hostility. The moment when two people who have been carrying something heavy both set it down at the same time, not for each other, just because it's time. She stood up. She buttoned her coat. She said, be present with them. Not financially present, actually present. That is the only thing I need from you. He said, I will. I'm going to try. She said, good. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then he shook it. She walked across the lobby. She did not look back, not to make a point, not for effect, not to demonstrate anything to anyone watching, simply because there was nothing left behind her that required looking at. Route 30 heading west. The Pennsylvania landscape doing what it does in spring, the kind of green that is almost aggressive in its insistence. Every field and tree and roadside ditch insisting on itself, on its own renewal, completely indifferent to whoever is driving past. Lily was asleep in her car seat. Lucas was awake, pressing his nose against the window with the expression of a man surveying territory. Somewhere past the farmland, she recognized the exit. The gas station. The small town with the mini-mart. Route 30, heading toward Lancaster, the same strip of road where 6 years ago she had stopped because she felt nauseated and walked into a fluorescent-lit bathroom and learned something that changed the direction of everything. She noticed the exit. She didn't say anything. She drove past it. Lucas said, Mom, are we going home? Yes, she said. Good, he said. I need to check on the frog situation. Lucas, she said. There's no frog. He said, there will be. From the back seat, Lily, not fully asleep after all, said, Mom? Is Grant going to come visit us? She thought about this honestly. Yes, she said. I think he will. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay. She settled back into her seat and closed her eyes again. Just okay. Okay in the way children say it, when the information has been received and processed and filed under things that are manageable. Okay, the way the world looks when someone you trust has told you it's going to be fine and you believe them. Okay. The rest of the drive was quiet. Lucas fell asleep somewhere in central Pennsylvania. Finally, he did not give in to sleep easily. He was too interested in everything to stop paying attention voluntarily. But eventually, the motion of the car and the afternoon warmth did what they always did. She drove through the landscape with two small sleeping people in the back seat. She thought about what it was to arrive at yourself after a long absence. Not triumphant, not even particularly dramatic, just, oh, there you are. I've been looking for you. The sage green kitchen, the drafting table by the window with the Japanese maple outside it, Howard, too, sleeping on the couch, Ruth's voice on the phone saying, I framed it. It's in my classroom. Lucas telling a woman who had not laughed in years a story about a frog and making her laugh 3 times. Lily arranging things by size, with perfect internal logic. A profile in an architecture publication that said she designed for the people who would actually live there. A life, a specific, actual, undeniable life. Not the life she had planned, not the life she was supposed to want, Not the life that required her to pour coffee a certain way and laugh a certain volume and call her own name on a project a unnecessary inconvenience. Her life, the one with the sage green and the loud laugh and the strong opinions about brutalist architecture and the two remarkable people asleep in the back seat. People ask me sometimes, what would you tell her? The 34-year-old version of you, sitting in that conference room, holding that cheap pen, about to sign her name to the end of 8 years. What would you say? I've thought about it a lot. Here's what I'd say. That diagnosis they used against you is not the whole truth. You knew that. Your body knew it before your mind did. Hold on to what you know. The small things you'd noticed. The cufflinks, the phone face down, the voice in the hallway. You were right. You were always right. You weren't imagining things. You weren't being paranoid. You were paying attention, and the thing you were paying attention to was real. You were just hoping you were wrong. You weren't wrong. You were just not ready yet to know you were right. Know you. The life you gave up to be acceptable to someone who was already planning to leave you. It didn't disappear. It went into storage. It waited. Your drafting table sat in that storage unit for 8 years, and it still knew how to hold your drawings. The sage green was still inside you, ready to be mixed again. The woman you were before, the one with the loud laugh and the strong opinions, and the cat named Howard, and the ability to spend 4 hours looking at paint chips and call it a good afternoon. She didn't vanish. She waited. Quietly, in whatever space you still had, she waited for you to come back. And when you came back to yourself, when you finally made the choice to be yourself, she didn't make a speech about it. She didn't demand an accounting of the years. She just said what Lily said when she understood things were going to be okay. She said, okay, because it was, because it is. The car moved through Pennsylvania in the late afternoon light. The mountains appeared on the horizon, the ones that mean you are close to Asheville, the ones that mean you are almost home. She pressed the window button down an inch. The spring air came in, cool and smelling of recent rain and the particular green of things that have been waiting underground all winter and have now decided it is time. She breathed it in. She thought about nothing complicated. She just drove, with her children asleep, toward home.
There is a moment in this story that I want you to sit with. Not the conference room, not the gas station bathroom, not even the park where two gray-eyed children met their father for the first time. The moment I want you to sit with is much smaller than any of those. It is Claire standing at a kitchen counter at 2 in the morning, holding a lemon zester she has owned for 11 years and never once used, and throwing it away. Because here is the truth. That story took 100 minutes to tell. We carry things long past the time they serve us. Not because we are weak, not because we are foolish, but because letting go requires us to admit that we made a choice, that the choice has passed, that the version of ourselves who needed that thing, who needed to be smaller, quieter, more convenient, more acceptable, is not the version we have to keep being. Claire didn't lose herself all at once. She lost herself slowly, through choices that each seemed reasonable in the moment. She stopped making coffee her way. She saw her best friend less. She painted over a wall the color she had mixed with her own hands. She didn't call back a client who had seen something extraordinary in her. Each of these things alone was nothing. Together, over years, they were a disappearing act. And the most important thing this story asks you to understand is this. That kind of disappearing is not love. Love does not require you to become less. Love does not use your medical file against you. Love does not put you on a calendar with an exit date. Love does not hand you someone else's definition of your worth and ask you to carry it like it's the truth. And if you have been carrying someone else's definition, if you have been living inside a story, someone else wrote about who you are and what you deserve and what is possible for you, I want you to hear what Claire heard in that gas station bathroom off Route 30. The doctor said, difficult, not impossible. Whatever they told you about yourself, whatever word was chosen carefully because it was convenient for someone else, I want you to find the word that's actually true. Not impossible. Difficult, maybe. Hard, maybe. Requiring courage you don't feel certain you have, maybe, but not impossible. Claire built a design firm from a spare bedroom above a pottery studio. She raised 2 remarkable children who knew exactly who they were because she knew exactly who she was. She walked back into a conference room 6 years later, not to demand anything, not to prove anything, not to punish anyone, but simply because her daughter needed something only the truth could provide, and she walked out of that conference room the same person she walked in. That is the victory, not the business success, not the profile in the architecture magazine, not the fact that Grant's company contracted while hers grew. The victory is that she walked in as herself and walked out as herself. That is harder than it sounds. That is the whole story. And I want to leave you with the 3 things I think this story is really about. First, the small things you notice are real. Trust them. You are not imagining things. You are not being paranoid. You are paying attention, and paying attention is not the same as inventing something. The cufflinks were real. The phone face down was real. The voice in the hallway was real. You always know. The question is only whether you're ready to know that you know. Second, you cannot lose yourself so thoroughly that you cannot find your way back. The sage green kitchen wall was painted over. The drafting table went into storage, the loud laugh was moderated, and every single one of those things came back. The table came back, the laugh came back, the color came back, the self that made those choices, that specific, opinionated, imperfect, extraordinary self, was in storage, not gone. It was waiting. And third, building a life is not a consolation prize. Starting over is not failure. The life Claire built in Asheville was not the lesser version of the life she was supposed to have. It was not plan B. It was not what you do when the real thing doesn't work out. It was the real thing. The roast on Sunday, the frog negotiations, the profile in the magazine, the phone call at 7:45 with 2 terrible gas station coffees. All of it real. All of it hers. That is what starting over can be if you are willing to start. If this story reached you today, if something in it felt familiar or hopeful or like something you needed to hear, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. That is all we ever ask of a story, that it finds the person who needs it and stays. Closing statement. This content was manually researched, developed, and carefully edited by our team with the intention of bringing you not just a story, but a perspective, a lesson, and a reminder of something true. Every word was chosen, every detail was considered, because we believe that the stories we tell each other matter, that they carry weight, that they find us at the exact moment we need them. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. This one was for you.